In 1953, among the vast collections of a British nobleman, a map was rediscovered that sent a quiet shockwave through the world of historical cartography. Hand-painted on a single sheet of parchment in 1424 by a Venetian cartographer named Giovanni Pizzigano, it was a 500-year-old Portolan chart. This is a stunningly practical map of coastlines and ports designed for sailors. It depicted the familiar shores of Western Europe and North Africa with remarkable precision for its time. But out in the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic, west of the Azores, it showed something impossible. It was a large, nearly perfectly rectangular island, colored a bold, confident red, and labeled Antillia. Interestingly, Antillia wasn't a simple phantom island, but a powerful myth born from the ashes of a fallen kingdom. The story of Antillia begins with a civilizational disaster. In the year 711 AD, the Visigothic kingdom that had ruled the Iberian Peninsula for centuries crumbled under the weight of an invasion by the Umayyad Caliphate. The last Visigothic king, Roderick, fell in battle, and within years, nearly all of what is now Spain and Portugal was under Muslim control. For the Christian population, it was a cataclysm. In the midst of this chaos, a legend of hope was born. The story, told and retold for centuries, centered on 7 Christian bishops who, led by the Archbishop of Porto, refused to submit to the new rulers. Around the year 714, they gathered their parishioners, boarded ships, and sailed west into the unknown Atlantic, a sea of monsters and myth, in search of a new home. According to the legend, they found it. After a perilous voyage, they landed on a large, fertile island where they established a Christian society, founding 7 cities. Each bishop was given the dominion over a city, and accounts even gave these settlements names, like Ira, Antua, and Ansali, lending a veneer of specificity to the tale. But the most crucial detail of the legend was a single dramatic act. Upon their arrival, the bishops ordered their ships to be burned. This was the point of no return. It transformed their desperate flight into a deliberate, permanent act of creation. They were no longer exiles, but founders, severing all ties to a homeland now lost to them. This story was a cultural and religious coping mechanism. In the face of civilizational collapse, it offered a narrative of continuity and divine sanction. It created an idealized Christian Visigothic Iberia that was safe, ordered, and pure, a stark contrast to the chaos of their conquered home. For 700 years, the story of the 7 bishops and their island sanctuary remained a powerful oral tradition. Then, in the 15th century, it took physical form. The 1424 Pizzigano chart gave Antillia its first known address, placing it firmly in the Atlantic. Its depiction was bizarre. Real islands aren't perfect rectangles, yet there it was, an impossibly geometric shape floating in the ocean. It was accompanied by a smaller archipelago, most notably a large blue rectangle to its north ominously named Satanazes, or the Isle of Devils. This pairing created a powerful symbolic geography in the middle of the ocean, a holy Christian sanctuary existing in direct opposition to a demonic, dangerous place. What's remarkable is that for the next 70 years, this strange depiction was copied by Europe's best map makers. Dozens of cartographers copied this Antillia group, along with the Devil Island, as if they were real places. This uniformity suggests they weren't plotting independent sightings, but were all working from a single, authoritative source that had become an accepted fact within the cartographic tradition. The name itself, Antillia, is widely believed to derive from the Portuguese ante ilha, meaning opposite island. This, combined with its rectangular shape, so similar to the outline of Portugal itself, has led many scholars to conclude that it was a symbolic projection. It was a piece of Portugal placed in the middle of the Atlantic. A phantom island on a map might seem like a historical curiosity, but Antillia had a very real impact on the world. During the 15th century, the legend transitioned from folklore to state policy. Portuguese monarchs, hungry for new lands and trade routes, treated Antillia as a plausible, even probable target for discovery. In a royal letter from 1475, King Afonso V granted the knight Fernão Teles the rights to the island and any other populated islands he might find in the western Atlantic. A decade later, in 1486, King John II issued a similar grant, authorizing another explorer to discover the island of 7 cities, a clear reference to Antillia. After 1492, as European ships began to crisscross the Atlantic, a problem emerged. Antillia wasn't where the map said it was. Explorers charted the Caribbean, finding a vast archipelago of islands, but no trace of 7 Visigothic cities. The legend, however, was too powerful to just disappear. Its name was simply applied to the newly discovered islands, the modern Antilles, a place name marking where the myth was potentially supposed to be. The core concept of the 7 cities, meanwhile, proved just as resilient. It detached itself from its island host and migrated, projecting itself onto the vast, unexplored mainland of North America. The legend also mutated. The focus shifted from a pious Christian refuge to rumors of unimaginable material wealth. As the Spanish conquered the Aztecs, the rumored cities became the 7 cities of gold, thought to be located in the American Southwest. These 7 cities of gold represented an early fusion of Spanish and Aztec myth-making. As the 16th century progressed and transatlantic navigation became routine, the space on the map for Antillia simply vanished. It was initially speculated that the islands could be something smaller than was imagined, and could still be out there in the Atlantic. However, increased traffic and more accurate charting provided overwhelming negative evidence, and the idea of this island disappeared. The modern consensus is clear. Antillia was a phantom island, but there is one more question surrounding it. Some believe that Giovanni Pizzigano had simply added it based on a misunderstanding of the Azores. For reference, the Azores were first permanently settled by the Portuguese, and that may indicate why there was a Portugal shape representing it. Others have proposed that it potentially represented Bermuda, though this island wouldn't be discovered until the early 16th century. Its origin remains an ongoing subject of debate amongst scholars. Perhaps it's a garbled account of a real place like the Azores, a cartographic error copied for decades, or just a purely symbolic representation of hope. Whatever the case, the name Antillia is now immortalized in the archipelago of islands in the Caribbean. Every year, thousands of pilgrims travel to the St. Thomas Church in Leipzig, Germany, drawn by the promise of standing in the presence of genius. They gather in the church's chancel, where a large bronze plaque set into the floor marks the grave of Johann Sebastian Bach. It's a solemn, powerful experience to be so close to the man who composed some of the most sublime music in human history. But this hallowed ground is built on a foundation of historical ambiguity, 19th century nationalistic fervor, and scientific theories that have long since crumbled. In a surprising twist, the skeleton beneath the floor may not be Bach at all, and the story of how it got there is a winding, century-and-a-half-long mystery. The story begins not with reverence but with neglect. When Johann Sebastian Bach died from a stroke on July 28, 1750, he was a respected local figure in Leipzig. He was a brilliant organist and former music director, but he wasn't widely known throughout Europe or even the Holy Roman Empire. 3 days after his death, his body was placed in an oak coffin and buried without ceremony in the Johannesfriedhof, the old St. John's Cemetery, just outside the city walls. Like most burials of the era, his grave was left unmarked, and within a few years, its exact location had been completely forgotten. The Johannesfriedhof was a poor choice for a lasting memorial. Established in the 13th century as a burial ground for a leper hospital, it was a chaotic, overcrowded space with a turbulent history. It had been used as a military camp during Napoleon's time, with soldiers reportedly burning old coffins for firewood. Locating a single, unmarked grave from 150 years prior seemed like an impossible task. Yet 2 fragile clues survived. The first was an archival note indicating Bach was buried in an oak coffin, a distinction given to only 12 of the 1,400 people who died in Leipzig that year. The second was a piece of oral tradition that only surfaced around the time of the search itself in 1894. It claimed Bach's grave was located 6 paces from the south door of St. John's Church. This tradition, however, was incredibly tenuous, originating from a 75-year-old man who said he'd been told the spot 60 years earlier by a 90-year-old gardener. Nobody else amongst the living had remembered this so-called tradition, aside from this one old man. By the late 19th century, a full-blown Bach revival was sweeping across Europe. Composers like Mendelssohn had championed his work, transforming him from a respected but somewhat obscure Baroque master into a German national hero. From there, his fame quickly rose outside his native land, and he quickly became accepted as one of the most talented composers in history. Musical pilgrims flocked to Leipzig, but there was no grave to visit, no central shrine for their adoration. The planned rebuilding of the Johanneskirche in 1894 provided the perfect opportunity to rectify this. A committee was formed, driven by civic and national pride, to find the composer's lost remains. The excavation that began in October 1894 was anything but a scientific undertaking. In fact, it looks like the team in charge took the notes from Heinrich Schliemann and applied them to this German archaeological site. Wilhelm Hiss, a professor of anatomy leading the effort, described the scene as a muddy pit filled with a heap of bones. After finding and discarding several pine coffins, they unearthed 3 oak caskets. The first contained a young woman. The second oak coffin was accidentally smashed to pieces by an overzealous excavator. But the third, found on October 22nd, held the well-preserved skeleton of an elderly man. In an environment of immense expectation, the conclusion was immediate and decisive. This had to be Bach. The search was driven not by impartial inquiry, but by a fervent desire for success, making it highly susceptible to confirmation bias. With a candidate skeleton secured, the task of proving its identity fell to science, or what passed for it at the time. Wilhelm Hiss took the lead, focusing his analysis on the skull, and offered the most 19th century scientific explanation you can imagine. He declared the skull had sturdy and strong features, befitting a man of distinction, or what modern observers call the argument from Giga Chaddism. All joking aside, though, known depictions from Bach's life do depict him as a bit of a Chad, so perhaps not the worst argument of all time given the person involved. Hiss even argued that certain features of the temporal bone suggested a highly developed sense of hearing, a trait one might expect in a great composer. This claim was called out by other experts even at the time, so he resorted to other ways to scientifically prove Bach was in the bones. He then commissioned a sculptor to quote-unquote recreate what the skull looked like in life, using known portraits of Bach as a guide during the process. Unsurprisingly, the bust came out looking entirely like the great composer himself. This logic was entirely circular. The reconstruction looked like Bach, because it was made to look like Bach, because it was done with reference to the great master. Half a century later, the bones were examined again before their final move. This time, a surgeon named Wolfgang Rosenthal noticed something new. He found abnormal bony growths, or exostoses, on the skeleton's pelvis and at muscle attachment points on the arms. He hypothesized that these were the result of occupational stress from a lifetime of playing the organ, a physically demanding activity involving repetitive foot and arm movements. To test his theory, he X-rayed 11 living professional organists and claimed they all showed similar growths. He proudly announced the discovery of a new ailment, Organistenkrankheit, or organist's disease, and declared the skeleton's identity confirmed beyond doubt. I know this might be trite to say, but I really do love how in German, you can just easily create a new, insanely specific word by cobbling a bunch of different words together. Like Wilhelm Hisse's theory, Rosenthal's was a compelling story, but it was also proven to be wrong. In a 2007 study published in the Medical Journal of Australia, researchers replicated his experiment, but added a crucial element: a control group of non-musicians. Their findings dismantled the theory completely. Only a third of the organists had the bony growths, while 75% of the non-organ playing control group did. The growths were simply common signs of aging and physical activity, not a unique marker of organists. Rosenthal's irreproducible disease was discredited, removing the last piece of supposed scientific evidence for the skeleton's identity. But let's get back to what happened after the bones were quote-unquote proved to be those of Bach. Despite the shaky identification, the bones were treated as sacred relics to one of the most talented people in history. In 1900, they were placed in a grand stone sarcophagus and interred in a crypt beneath the altar of the rebuilt St. John's Church. On December 4th, 1943, Allied bombs rained down on Leipzig, and St. John's was destroyed. In a twist of fate that only deepened the legend, the crypt somehow survived the inferno, and the sarcophagus was recovered from the ruins in 1949, its contents unharmed. This miraculous preservation set the stage for the final chapter of their journey. On July 28, 1950, the 200th anniversary of Bach's death, the remains were moved to their present location in St. Thomas Church. This is the very place where Bach had worked as music director for 27 years. The reinterment was a major state event in what was then East Germany, with the new bronze grave cover sponsored by the Soviet Union. This was a political act that claimed Bach's legacy for the new regime and was implicitly an act of reconciliation between the Soviets and their new German satellite state. Today, there is no scientific consensus that the remains in St. Thomas Church are those of Johann Sebastian Bach. In fact, most modern assessments conclude that it's highly unlikely. The entire case rests on a chain of weak links: a dubious oral tradition, a chaotic and biased excavation, and two discredited scientific theories. By the standards of modern forensic anthropology, the identification process of 1894 was appallingly inadequate, lacking proper documentation, site mapping, or a chain of custody. There is one tool that could likely solve this mystery for good: genetic analysis. A comparison between DNA extracted from the skeleton and that from the known remains of one of Bach's sons could provide a definitive answer. While analyzing antique DNA is challenging due to degradation and contamination, modern techniques are increasingly capable of such feats. Yet, no test has ever been done. To date, the church authorities at St. Thomas have refused all requests for DNA analysis, including a formal scientific proposal. And so, the mystery endures. The skeleton in the chancel of St. Thomas Church remains a powerful symbol, a physical link to a transcendent artist. But whether it is a true relic, or simply the anonymous remains of a Leipzig citizen caught up in a story of national pride? We may never know. Perhaps in the end, it doesn't matter. Bach's true, incorruptible remains aren't buried in Leipzig. They're encoded in the notes of the Mass in B minor and the Brandenburg Concertos, among numerous other works, a legacy that needs no bones to prove its immortality. Close your eyes for a moment and listen. Not to the world you know, but to a world that's been silent for over 300 years. Imagine the sound of the island of Mauritius before humans. It's a symphony of buzzing insects, the rustle of giant tortoises through dense undergrowth, the calls of brightly colored parrots in trees. There's one very unusual noise, though, the pigeon-like coo of a large flightless bird, foraging for fallen fruit on the forest floor. This was the world of the dodo, an ecosystem that evolved in splendid isolation for millions of years. Now, listen again. That symphony is gone. In its place is a profound silence, a quiet defined by the absence of its most famous resident. The story of the dodo isn't the simple fable you might remember from childhood, the tale of a stupid bird that was too clumsy to survive. It's a far more complex and tragic story of a creature perfectly adapted to one world and catastrophically unprepared for the new one that arrived. Mauritius is a volcanic island, a lonely peak thrust up from the floor of the Indian Ocean, never connected to any mainland. This isolation was the master architect of its unique ecology. Before human settlement, it was a paradise cloaked in a mosaic of forests, from dry coastal woods to misty upland cloud forests, interspersed with palm-rich savannas. The most crucial feature of this world was what it lacked: terrestrial mammalian predators. With no large carnivores stalking the forest floor, the island's fauna evolved along a different path. Giant tortoises and skinks roamed freely, and the only native mammals were friendly bats that had made the perilous journey over the ocean there. In this sanctuary, the dodo's ancestors, pigeons that likely arrived from Southeast Asia millions of years ago, found an environment where their old adaptations were no longer necessary. Flying is an incredibly energy-intensive activity, a biological luxury maintained for escaping predators or finding scarce food. On Mauritius, food was abundant on the ground, and there was nothing to escape from ever. So, over countless generations, the dodo's ancestors traded the sky for the ground. Their wings shrank, their bodies grew larger and more robust. Similarly, their reproductive strategy adapted to this life of safety. With no predators to raid their nests, female dodos laid only a single, large egg at a time. This allowed them to invest all their energy into one promising offspring rather than simply blasting out as many eggs as possible and hoping one chick survives. The traits that would later be seen as flaws, flightlessness, largeness, and a low birth rate, weren't flaws at all. They were the pinnacle of evolutionary success in the peaceful world the dodo had always known. You might not like it, but this is what peak bird physiology looks like. The popular image of the dodo is a caricature, a comically fat, clumsy, and dim-witted bird. This picture, largely shaped by 17th century European artists like Roland Savory, painting overfed, captive specimens, is almost entirely wrong. And in case you're one of those people who just listens, now would be the time to look. I'm sure this painting is familiar to many of you. Modern analysis of the dodo's skeletal structure reveals a bird that wasn't obese but athletic and robust, with strong legs capable of navigating the island's uneven terrain. In the wild, it likely weighed up to 40 pounds and was far leaner than the caricatures suggest. It also stood about 3.5 feet tall and was a powerful ground dweller perfectly suited to its niche. Its mind, too, has been unfairly maligned. The idea of the dumb dodo is likely a myth. For those of you who aren't native English speakers, dumb as a dodo is a fairly common phrase, meaning that someone is, well, exceedingly stupid. In 2016, scientists discovered that its brain-to-body size ratio was on par with that of a modern pigeon, a bird known for its intelligence and trainability. Even more revealing was the structure of its brain. Unlike most birds, which have large optic lobes for keen eyesight, the dodo had an unusually large and well-developed olfactory bulb. This strongly suggests that the dodo navigated its world not primarily by sight, but by smell, sniffing out the fallen fruits, nuts, and roots that made up its diet on the dark forest floor. Yet for all its successful adaptations, its reproductive strategy, that single precious egg laid in a simple nest of grass on the ground, would be its Achilles heel. The end began not with a bang, but with the creak of timber and the splash of an anchor. While Portuguese sailors may have been the first Europeans to glimpse Mauritius around 1507, the pivotal moment came in 1598, with the arrival of Dutch ships. Having evolved for millennia without fear of predators, the dodos were innately trusting and easily approached, making them simple targets for hungry sailors. But the common idea that humans simply hunted the dodo to extinction is too simple. While hunting certainly contributed, several accounts from sailors noted that dodo meat was tough, greasy, and just generally disgusting. The direct human hunt was just the opening act of a much larger ecological tragedy. The true devastation was an invasion, silent and insidious. The Dutch ships brought with them a host of stowaways and livestock that were alien to Mauritius: rats, pigs, dogs, cats, and monkeys. In an environment with no natural predators of their own, these invasive species exploded in number. They were perfectly equipped to exploit the dodo's greatest vulnerability, its single egg, laid defenseless on the forest floor. A single hungry pig could wipe out the reproductive efforts of an entire dodo population far more efficiently than a crew of sailors ever could. This biological assault was compounded by the physical destruction of the dodo's world. The Dutch began systematically felling the island's ancient forests, seeking valuable ebony wood for export to Europe and clearing land for settlements. This habitat destruction fragmented the remaining dodo populations, squeezing them into ever smaller pockets, where they were even more vulnerable to the new predators. Simply put, the dodo faced a three-pronged attack of hunting, invasive predators, and habitat loss that unraveled an ecosystem in less than a century. Pinpointing the exact moment the last dodo perished is a forensic analysis clouded by the fog of history. The last universally accepted sighting of a living dodo was made in 1662 by a shipwrecked Dutch sailor named Volkert Everts. He and his companions found the birds not on the main island, but on a small offshore islet, a telling detail that suggests the species had already been wiped out on the main island. After that, the trail goes cold, complicated by a case of mistaken identity and several later accounts which mention sightings of dodos into the 1670s and 1680s. However, linguistic and historical analysis suggests that as the true dodo disappeared, settlers transferred its familiar name to another flightless bird. This creature, called the red rail, is also now extinct, but without a clear physical description, these later textual references are ambiguous. But notably, modern science and statistical techniques have offered a new tool to peer into the silence and figure out when the dodo went extinct. In 2003, researchers applied a statistical method called optimal linear estimation to the known record of dodo sightings. By analyzing the decreasing frequency of reliable observations, the model calculated the statistical probability of the species' survival over time. The conclusion was that the dodo likely persisted, unseen and dwindling, for another generation after the 1662 encounter, and they arrived at a date of 1690 as most probable. Whatever the case, the last dodo perished alone, a century after its tropical Garden of Eden was shattered.